You know how it is, you're trying to keep up, stay informed, but honestly, sometimes it feels like you need a law degree just to figure out what's going on in the news.
It can be overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're here for. Today, we're doing a deep dive, really getting into a significant development in India, this growing friction between the government and the Supreme Court.
And it's fascinating right from the start, isn't it? Just the language being used.
Yeah.
What stands out?
Well, we're hearing things like the Supreme Court being called a super parliament or wielding nuclear weapons. That's pretty dramatic language.
Nuclear weapons. Wow. Okay.
Right. But the key thing, I think, is that this isn't just, political name calling. It actually points to a really fundamental question about the balance of power, how things are supposed to work under India's constitution.
Okay, so let's maybe just quickly set the scene. Like a lot of democracies, India's constitution sets up those three main pillars, right? Legislature, executive, judiciary.
The legislature makes the laws, the executive puts them into action, and the judiciary interprets them. And the whole idea is this system of checks and balances. Each branch keeps the others in check, basically.
Exactly. But what the sources we're looking at suggest is that this very balance, it seems to be under a bit of strain right now.
Strain how?
Well, you got a strong government, one with a pretty clear mandate on one side, and then you have the Supreme Court, whose job is essentially to be the final protector of the Constitution and, crucially, citizens' fundamental rights.
Right, the guardian role.
Precisely. So our goal here in this deep dive is to really pinpoint where these friction points are, where are they clashing, and maybe more importantly, what could all this tension mean, for India's democracy down the road and also for you, for the average citizen.
Okay, let's jump right in then. A big example that's come up is this controversy around the Waqf Act. Can you sort of lay out the basics of that?
Sure. So at its core, this is about changes the government is proposing to the Waqf Act. Now, Waqf properties, they're basically religious or charitable endowments under Islamic law.
Okay.
And many of these have histories going back centuries. The government's position, or what seems to be its position, is that if these properties aren't officially registered in a certain way, their status as legitimate Waqf properties could potentially be challenged.
And that sounds like more than just a technical legal point. The Supreme Court has actually gotten involved here, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They've stepped in quite actively. The court has raised some pretty serious questions about what effect these changes might have.
On whom?
Specifically on the rights of literally millions of Muslim citizens who have ties, historical or community ties to these properties.
Millions, yeah.
And what's really interesting is how the court is framing it. They're saying this isn't just some property dispute over land titles.
Right.
They're framing it as a fundamental issue. It's about protecting the constitutional guarantees for a really significant part of the population.
So we're talking about potential impacts on constitutional rights, not just ownership documents. Where does this stand right now? What's the latest?
Well, the government has said it plans to bring forward historical records, documents going back as far as 1929 to, back up its position.
Okay.
But in the meantime, and this is really key, the Supreme Court has put a stay on any action. They've basically hit pause on the whole thing while these really serious constitutional questions are looked at.
Got it. A temporary halt. Now, you mentioned earlier this might not be a one-off thing. The sources we've reviewed suggest the Waqf Act issue is maybe part of a wider pattern.
That's certainly the impression you get. It seems like the Waqf Act situation fits into this broader trend where the Supreme Court has been, let's say, more actively questioning or pushing back against government actions or interpretations lately.
Can you give some examples? What else fits this pattern?
Sure. I mean, think about the really significant observations the court made concerning Article 370 and the special status of Jammu and Kashmir.
Right, that was huge.
Huge. Yeah. And deeply political, major constitutional implications. The fact that the court engaged so deeply there really underscores its role in examining even the biggest government moves through that constitutional lens.
Okay, Article 370, that's a massive one. What other areas?
Well, another one is the sedition law. It's been on the books for a very long time, but the Supreme Court has been asking some tough questions about whether it's still appropriate, its potential for misuse today.
The balance between security and free speech, kind of.
Exactly, that tension,
Yeah.
which, comes up in lots of democracies. Then there's the electoral bonds case.
Political funding.
Right. The court came down pretty strongly there on the need for more transparency in how political parties get their money. That was a direct challenge to the government scheme.
Okay, so transparency and funding. Any others?
We've also seen the judiciary granting bail in several cases related to the Delhi riots. Now, those decisions, depending on your perspective, might seem to differ from the government's view on those events.
Sensitive cases.
Very. And even something that seems maybe less charged, like when the government temporarily banned Wikipedia, the Supreme Court actually stepped in there too, asking the government to explain its reasoning.
Even Wikipedia. Okay, so it really is across a wide range of things. National security, political money, individual freedoms, online information access.
Yeah, a real mix.
The Supreme Court seems to be actively engaging, sometimes in ways that, well, act as a check on government power. Which brings us to another case mentioned in the sources, the one involving the Tamil Nadu governor. What happened there?
Right, this involved a dispute between the Tamil Nadu state government and the governor of the state. The Supreme Court made a really important ruling. It was about the governor basically sitting on bills passed by the state assembly indefinitely.
Like a pocket veto, just not acting on them.
Exactly, sometimes called a pocket veto. The court said very clearly that a governor can't just do that. They can't withhold assent forever without taking some kind of action. It was like, a deliberate roadblock in the legislative process.
That sounds like a direct hit on the authority of a governor, a pretty key constitutional role. And this is where that Article 142 comes in, the one described with that nuclear weapon phrase.
That's the one, Article 142 of the Constitution. It basically gives the Supreme Court this extraordinary power to issue any order needed to ensure complete justice is done.
Complete justice. That sounds broad.
It is broad.
Right.
And it's not something the court uses lightly. It's really meant for exceptional situations, where the usual legal paths might not be enough to get a fair outcome, often in cases with big public interest implications.
And they used it in the Tamil Nadu case.
They did. The Supreme Court actually invoked Article 142 to essentially push through the bills that the governor had been holding up.
So they didn't just rule, they used this special power to make sure the laws actually passed. Okay, I can see why someone might use some strong language to describe that power.
Yeah, and what's really significant about them using Article 142 here is what it hints at, right? It suggests that maybe the standard constitutional checks and balances weren't enough to break that particular deadlock. It implies the court felt it had to step in with this extraordinary measure just to make sure democratic governance could actually function at the state level in this instance.
That's quite something. Now, the source material also brought up something interesting about how these roles, like governor or even the vice president, are perceived now, that they might be seen as more political.
Yes, that's a really critical point raised. The original idea, the intention behind these offices, was largely that they'd be impartial, constitutional guardians, sort of above the day-to-day political fights.
Right, not party figures.
Not primarily, no. So if there's now a growing feeling of perception that these roles are being driven more by political loyalties or considerations, well, that can chip away at the whole system of checks and balances.
Yes.
And it could almost inevitably lead to more friction, couldn't it? Between these offices and other constitutional bodies, like the Supreme Court, which still sees itself as the ultimate interpreter and protector of those founding principles.
Okay, so let's bring this back down to earth a bit. For the person listening, the average citizen, what does all this mean? Why should we care if these big institutions seem to be disagreeing more often?
Well, connecting it directly to, your life. When you see conflict between key constitutional bodies, it can matter in a few ways. First, it can just erode public trust, can't it? Trust in the very institutions that are supposed to serve and protect your rights.
Yeah, definitely.
And second, the actual protection of your rights could be at stake. I mean, look at the Waqf Act issue we talked about. Those proposed changes could directly impact the lives and rights of a huge number of people.
Real-world consequences.
Absolutely. You need the government to make policy, and you need the judiciary to make sure those policies stick to the constitutional rules. Both are vital for a democracy that actually protects your freedoms. When they're constantly clashing, it can create a lot of uncertainty about whether those protections will hold up.
So the picture painted by the source seems to be one of maybe India being at a kind of critical point, a potential stress test for its constitutional setup.
That's definitely the feeling you get from the analysis. This rise in conflict, rather than, say, constructive dialogue between these core institutions, is presented as a really significant development. The source even hints that maybe the Supreme Court becoming more assertive recently could be seen as a hopeful sign for democracy.
A ray of hope, I think was the phrase used.
Something like that, yes. A sign that it's willing to actively step up and defend constitutional values.
But the big question left hanging, right, is whether this judicial activism, if you want to call it that, will actually be enough. enough to handle these challenges and what happens next, both with specific things like the Waqf Act and just the overall relationship between the courts and the government. It really does feel like a pivotal moment.
It certainly does. And that really leads us to the final question, the one our source poses directly to, well, to you, the listener.
Right. What was that again?
It asks, in this time, this era of constitutional challenge, do we, as citizens, maybe need to rethink our own role? Is protecting the Constitution just the job of the courts? Or is it actually a responsibility that all of us share?
That's a powerful thought to end on. It really forces you to consider, what's the citizen's role in keeping democracy healthy, especially when the institutions designed for that seem to be under pressure. Something definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope it gave you some clarity on these really critical issues.